This is Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.
And I came to volume 3 and I just thought, well, it's not going to be the same. This was some months down the road. And I read that volume and I had the same experience. And I thought, this is the volume that Christ's church needs today, because it addresses these matters of worship of God and conduct of life in the church government, the role of pastors, the role of deacons, and church discipline.
Hello and welcome to Theology on the Go. My name is Jonathan Master. I'm joined, as always, by my friend and co-host James Dolezal. James, how are you today?
Jonathan, I'm wonderful and looking forward to continuing our conversation with David Chanski about Pastor Martin's 3-volume Pastoral Theology.
Yes, this will be part 2 of our conversation with Pastor Chanski, and we're roughly trying to center our episodes around the volumes of this Pastoral Theology book. So let's get started now with episode 2, volume 2, which addresses the man of God in his preaching and teaching duties. And so it might be conceived of as almost a bit of a homiletics course, although it's really much more than that. But there is a significant, well, there are actually 2 significant units in this volume on conceiving of and preparing sermons, how sermons are to be prepared. And so I wonder if you could just walk us through that. Obviously, these are long sections, and so we can't go through them in detail, but what are some of the standout features of what Pastor Martin says regarding the preparation and conception of sermons to be preached?
Yes. So here's where I'll do what you had suggested earlier, and especially focus on things that stood out to me and even do stand out to me. We're going through some of these things right now with some of our men here, younger men here in the church, and watching the videos together with them and then having discussions about them. But one of them is that we listened to not that long ago, maybe it was a few months now, but the whole lectures on, I think there are a couple of them, on perspicuity of form and structure. And after now 35 years in the ministry, I look at that and I think, I don't know if there's a more important element in preaching that could be emphasized, especially when I think of, one, how helpful it has been to me to hear those things and learn them early on, and then also then to set myself on a track, I should say, of aiming to do that, have perspicuity of form and structure, clarity in my outline, if you will, so that not only do I know what I am wanting to say, but that I'm able to say it and people are able to grasp it. When young men ask me about their preaching, I almost inevitably, when it's their earlier efforts, focus on this, because this is where, generally speaking, there is glaring lack. So that to me was a very important thing, and the way Pastor Martin talked about it and saying it really takes painstaking labor, and it never really ends. I mean, I heard him say that when he was in his 50s first, and I heard him teach it when he was in his 70s, and he was still emphasizing the same thing. And going along with that, then, the importance of simplicity in preaching. Just to speak about my own experience, I'm more of an intellectual type by nature, and I would gravitate to that kind of preaching, if you will. And so when we came to these lectures on simplicity, and then we had to read something by Ryle on simplicity in preaching, it was so revelatory to me and so humbling to say, I don't want to show people how much I know. I just want to help them to understand what the Bible is saying. And I think God used that in my life and in my preaching. And so that was a very significant thing. The lectures on applicatory preaching, the importance of application in preaching, were really excellent and important. And even I think of what he said about the use of the manuscript in preaching, which is a very dull thing, and you think not that important overall, but it does kind of highlight what I think, and this is a broader stroke, but I think this is a good thing for me to say about these lectures. For all the work he did and all the strong opinions he has, one real strength of his approach is he'll tell you the different ways that men looked at this or that or the other thing, like the use of the manuscripts. Some men like J.W. Alexander and Dabney were very strong about urging men to be able to preach without using a manuscript. And then there were some who, would use a full manuscript, and maybe the Puritans did that because if you have 20 applications, you kind of need that.
How are you going to keep track of all of that?
That's exactly. But anyway, he would present the different views on that, or the different views about whether consecutive expository preaching is the only kind of preaching. He would say, well, here's the one view, here's the other view. But then he would say, he would quote this nursery rhyme. Jack Sprat could eat no fat, his wife could eat no lean, and so between them both, you see, they lick the platter clean. And his point was, everybody's different. And that is so helpful and so freeing, especially when you're hearing these lectures from I'll call him a preaching giant like Pastor Martin, because your temptation is to think, I have to be just like him. And he had lectures in which he told us, you don't need to be just like me or any other preacher. And he would say, study all preachers that God has used, whether it's Paul or Apollos, all things are yours. But he said, understand who you are and be content with it. Be comfortable in your own skin. And when you get up to preach in such a way that everyone says, that's Dave Chanski, or that's James Dolezal. So that was very, very helpful stuff.
I'm wondering, as we move from the preparation to the delivery, sometimes addressing students on the delivery of sermons can be difficult because we know that it's important, but on the other hand, there is such a danger of being overly self-aware, practicing your gestures in front of a mirror, making sure your elocution comes across in just the right way, these kinds of things. And so I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how Pastor Martin addresses that, because he does speak about the delivery of sermons, but he speaks about the delivery of sermons, I think, carefully and with a sort of spiritual mindedness and a recognition that the preacher has to be humbly submitting himself to God's word, and that men are different.
Yes. So he speaks about this in such a way that I think he helps his students to get through the difficulties that you're suggesting are present. In other words, when I get up in the pulpit, I don't want to be conscious of everything I do and everything I say. Let me rephrase that. I don't want to be focused mainly on those things and how I come across. But at the same time, I do want to come across as a minister of Christ. I want to come across as someone who knows what he's about, someone who has confidence in what he's doing and saying, and so on, and someone who is going to be an effective preacher. One of the passages Pastor Martin would use frequently in the sections on preaching, and especially the act of preaching, would be, I think it's Acts 14:1, where it says that Paul and Barnabas so spoke that a number of people believed. I'm just paraphrasing that there, but he'd emphasize that so spoke and what all is involved in that. But the point is, he like James said earlier, he has studied preaching in a way that most men have not. And he made that his life. And then he made it his life to try to preach the way that he learned would be effective. But he would tell us that you don't want to be overly self-conscious while you're preaching. You want to focus on these things. You want to do what it takes behind the scenes. Maybe it's learning how to pronounce certain words, or to have better English. But you don't want to be thinking about that in the study. In other words, in the pulpit, you do that in the study. You do a lot of things behind the scenes. And he would go down, to even things about the way you look and the way you dress and things like that. But we have to realize that if we're not self-aware enough, our preaching is going to be hindered in its effectiveness by our neglect of self-awareness. So, for instance, let's say a man has distracting mannerisms and he doesn't think about it, or when somebody says it to him, he says, well, that's just the way I am, or he has distracting habits of speech. I mean, we have a lot of educated people in our congregation. A lot of people wouldn't care that much if I used prepositions that are supposed to be subjects as objects of prepositions. They might not care about it. Some people, it might bother them. And Pastor Martin's approach would be, don't give people things that will turn their minds away, for no good reason. And it's not a good reason that you're not willing to work hard enough to overcome. Maybe it's even a speech impediment that you have that you could say is natural. I mean, I know this one man, and I use him as an example when I talk to people sometimes. He grew up in a big city, in a rough part of town. He got involved in gangs. He got involved in drugs. He ended up at a mission, and God saved him at the mission. And he came across Pastor Martin's lectures at some point. And I knew him before and after. And he used to talk like a guy that you'd think, that guy, he's from the ghetto. And now he talks like somebody who's an educated man, because he is an educated man, largely self-educated, but he certainly doesn't have a college degree. But the reason he said he worked very hard to overcome his old sloppy habits was because he wanted to be an effective preacher of Christ's gospel.
I think this is an important point, and I think Pastor Martin stands in a long line of older instruction on mannerism and preaching. If you remember the large edition of Spurgeon's Lectures to My Students, he talks in there actually about certain gestures.
Yes, he does.
And even the way that you hold your posture in the pulpit. And he gets downright insulting. He actually even has a cartoonist draw
Yes.
caricatures of preachers who look like penguins or something like that,
Yeah,
because
that's
they
right.
just aren't being mindful about how they present themselves externally. And I think the point of Spurgeon and of Pastor Martin was not self-aggrandizement. It was not to present yourself as hoity-toity or country club. I don't think that was the point. I think the point was to remove distractions, not to bring attention to yourself. And clear diction is not a stumbling block for those who don't know how to speak clearly. But unclear diction is a stumbling block for those who do. So the whole point of improving your diction is not so you can sound like Sir Laurence Olivier, who had beautiful diction, but actually just so that you will be more out of the way and effective in the communicating of such a glorious truth.
Absolutely.
That's how I understand that section on delivery. But I think it does something a lot of modern books don't do that older books used to do, which is, I like to say it this way, in the modern vernacular, they get up into your business.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
He confronts certain tics and mannerisms, and also we've been given wives to help us with this as well.
Yes.
Who care for us and who alert us to the fact that there are annoying and distracting things that we do that we should work on minimizing. But again, not to dress up ourselves, but to get ourselves more out of the way.
Amen. Amen. And he does emphasize that too at various points in the lectures, the willingness to listen to people like your wife, fellow elders, and other mature people in the congregation. And he would even say, you can learn from everyone, but, as preachers, you men probably are aware that there's a lot of people who just like to criticize preachers, and they may not have a lot really to say. And he taught us that you shouldn't let yourself be bound in your conscience by everybody who has any criticism to make.
Right.
Well, James, this volume on preaching and teaching is one of the ones that I think it stands out in a number of ways. First of all, he gives extensive commentary on the preparation of sermons and even the delivery of sermons. And sometimes that can get, and we reference this in our conversation, sometimes that can get a little overly dramatic, or it can be oriented too much around individual ways of preaching. But what I think Pastor Martin does so well is he understands that each preacher is going to be slightly different. Each man is different, and yet there are overarching biblical principles that can govern our preaching. And he does, of course, have some fairly definite ideas, but as was mentioned in the conversation, he is so broad in his survey of other people's ideas that it's not as if he's presenting this as the only way that any faithful preacher could have ever conceived of the act of preaching.
This is a book full of the volume 2 is a book full of wisdom, especially about just pulpit mannerisms. I would say first, I think all of us who preach on a regular basis, in my case, I'm a full-time professor, but have the honor of filling the pulpit often. And then those who have that as their full-time vocation, filling the pulpit week in and week out, that I think all of us would acknowledge that we can improve in the area of preparation and even of delivery. The meticulous instruction that he gives on certain aspects of mannerism, though, does not come off as promoting an affected kind of pulpit presence that isn't you, but also that there are things about you and about me that might be an annoyance to people, and we don't even realize we are annoying people those ways. And Pastor Martin is there to be that guy, so to speak, who says to you, brother, your breath stinks, or he'll go all the way down to things about mindful about how you present yourself to your people, just being thoughtful to remove the offense that we can be, even without realizing that we're being that, without becoming a sort of hypochondriac who is over obsessed with minutia. I don't think the volume comes off that way, but it's a rare kind of pastoral theology volume that gives attention. It's like a good friend coming alongside of you, putting his arm around your shoulder and saying, hey, can I make some suggestions on how you present yourself to people in a way that would help that presentation be more effective because perhaps less offensive or distracting? So I think there's a lot of just practical wisdom and counsel that comes through in this book that often, for whatever reason, people are remiss to say those things to others, perhaps because they don't want to risk giving offense. I like the fact that Pastor Martin risks giving offense here to address some of those issues that are often people are thinking them, they're just not saying them.
Yeah, and this would be an excellent refresher, even for men who have been in the ministry for some time and who have sort of honed their preaching gifts and learned many things about themselves and about the work of preaching. This is a good reminder of some of the key elements and some things that you may not have thought about, or you may not have thought about for some time. Again, oftentimes we don't get this kind of feedback in the ministry after our first few years, and so it's helpful to receive that from Pastor Martin in this volume. Well, if you are interested in reading these, our friends at Trinity Book Service have donated copies of this 3-volume pastoral theology set that we've been discussing. If you're interested in that, you can go to theologyonthego.org and enter your information for a chance to win. Also on that site is a code for anyone to go and purchase the set for themselves and receive a discount when they buy. If you are able to donate to the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, that helps us in our work. You can do that at alliancenet.org or at placefortruth.org. And if you know someone who might benefit from this podcast or someone who might be interested, please pass it along to them. And if you can rate and review the podcast, that helps us spread the word as well. As always, thank you for listening to Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.